The first snow came early that year. A soft hush laid over the bitterroots like a blanket drawn over a sleeping child. By dawn, the valley was wrapped in white, sky and earth barely discernible from one another. Pines drooped under the weight, and smoke curled thin from chimneys in the basin below, signs of life clinging quietly in the cold. She came through the trees with a torn hem and blood on her hands. Her boots were soaked through, each step a gasp of cold. Snow clung to her skirts and hair, and the wind had burned the flush from her cheeks, but her eyes were wide open, alert like a cornered animal. She didn't look back. Not once. At the edge of the ridge, she paused just long enough to listen. Nothing behind but the hush of snow settling, the groan of old limbs under fresh weight. Her breath came in steam. A raven called once, sharp as a nail struck into silence. Then she moved again, down the slope toward whatever lay beyond, her body driven not by direction, but by the urgent need to be somewhere else. The wreckage she'd fled burned out in the distance, a faint curl of black barely visible now against the gray swell of sky. A cabin gone to cinders, a past she'd let blaze. He saw her from the porch, far below the ridge where his land flattened out into meadow and creek. Just a flicker at first, dark against the white. He squinted, hand raised to shield his eyes from the dazzle. She moved like someone chasing daylight or fleeing its end. He knew that kind of movement. He'd worn it once. He stepped down into the snow, letting the screen door swing closed behind him. It creaked and clicked, and the sound startled a jay from a nearby branch. The bird flew off into the stillness, and he watched it go, then turned back toward her. She hadn't seen him yet. He didn't move toward her. Not yet. There was something brittle in her gait, something that said too much had already been taken. He stayed still, a tall figure in a wool coat, the brim of his hat heavy with snow. From where he stood, he could see the stagger in her steps, the limp that worsened when she thought no one was watching. Whatever she was running from had left its mark deep. Her name, when he learned it days later, was Ada. But that morning she was only a silhouette, ragged and quiet, cut from the edge of the storm. And still, she came down the hill like she belonged to no one and nowhere. Inside the house, the stove crackled low. A pot of beans simmered slowly, untouched since dawn. He glanced back once, then returned his gaze to her. Closer now. She'd seen the smoke from his chimney, maybe the fence line, or the black mare tethered near the shed. Whatever it was, it had drawn her here. A choice made in desperation, not trust, but still a choice. When she finally crossed the property line, she didn't look up, didn't meet his eyes. Just paused, one boot sinking deep, shoulders trembling not from cold but exhaustion. She used up everything she had to get this far. He cleared his throat once, soft. "You hurt." She flinched at the sound, eyes darting like she expected the woods to erupt behind her. Then she shook her head, slow and stubborn. "Not askin' for charity," she said. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw from wind or screaming or both. He heard what she didn't say: "Don't touch me, don't follow, don't pity." He nodded, not smiling, not moving. "Didn't figure you were." She stood there a long while, breathing hard. Then at last she looked at him, straight on, not defiant, not pleading, just stripped of all the armor folks usually wore, a kind of naked truth. He hadn't seen that look since the war ended. He stepped back, pushing the door open wide. The smell of wood smoke and warmth spilled out behind him. "You can come in," he said, "or keep walkin'. Your call." She stared at the open door like it might vanish if she blinked. But finally, with one hand pressed to her ribs, she moved forward. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. They just stood there a moment longer, on either side of the threshold, snow melting between them. Then she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a quiet thud, muffled by the storm still thickening outside. Inside, the air was steeped in pine smoke and the low heat of the stove. A kettle hissed faintly in the corner, and the room was dim, just lamplight and fire glow dancing against wooden walls. She stood near the doorway, dripping onto the floorboards. Snow darkened her sleeves and gathered in her tangled hair. She looked smaller without the trees behind her, without the sky to stretch into, like a breath held too long. He didn't speak, just moved slow, careful, like around a spooked horse. He pulled a blanket from the rocker and set it on the table. Then he ladled a portion of beans into a tin bowl and set it beside the blanket. No gesture toward it, no insistence. She didn't thank him. Just stood a moment longer, reading the room like one reads a map, searching for danger or distance, some clue about the man who lived here alone on the edge of nowhere. He sat down by the stove, his chair angled so he could see her without staring. His hat rested on a peg, revealing dark hair streaked in silver and a jagged scar that ran just above one brow. He didn't seem interested in questions, just waited. She moved finally, sat stiffly at the table, not touching the food, her fingers twitching now and then like she wasn't sure they were hers anymore. He spoke only once more that hour. "Cold'll find its way into your bones, if you let it." She looked up then, not quite meeting his eyes. "It already has." After that, the silence settled thick, but it wasn't hostile, just worn in like the house itself. Built to hold what the world couldn't, night came early. Snow kept falling. He let her be. She didn't sleep that first night. He could tell from the way the floor creaked soft now and then, her pacing a quiet, lopsided rhythm. In the dark, she pressed her ear to the walls like she expected them to speak. More than once, she cracked the door just enough to check the sky, the woods, her breath in the cold. Come dawn, she was still in the same clothes. Her boots steamed by the hearth, her dress stiff with dried blood and soot. She hadn't eaten more than a few bites. He made coffee and said nothing. That second morning, she asked for a knife. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Just handed her a small one, blade dull from years of cutting kindling and carving hides. She took it without explanation and spent the day in the yard, fashioning something out of willow branches. He watched from the window while pretending not to. By evening, she'd made herself a crutch, better than most he'd seen. Her limp steadied after that. 3 days passed. She never gave her name, never asked for his. But on the fourth morning, he found her in the barn, kneeling beside the black mare. The horse didn't spook. Just let the girl rest her forehead to its flank and breathe. "She ain't been touched by anyone but me," he said from the doorway. She looked over, neither guilty nor startled. "She trusts me," she said. Her voice had changed, still low, still scraped thin, but steadier. "She's got sense then," he said, then added, "Name's Callum." She nodded once. He waited, but she said nothing more, still held her name like a secret folded into paper, not ready to unfold. That night, she ate a full bowl of beans. On the 5th day, the storm broke. Sunlight filtered through the trees, pale and cold, and the world glittered like glass. She stood outside long, face turned to the sky, blinking like someone who forgot how light could feel. He watched from the porch, arms crossed. "You leavin'?" he asked finally. Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn. "I don't know where to go." He nodded. "That's different than not wantin' to go." She looked back then, and something flickered in her eyes. Not recognition, not yet. But maybe the faintest trace of it. Like she saw him, really saw him for the first time. She stayed. Through late December, they moved around each other like two ghosts occupying the same ruin. She mended things, his shirts, the broken latch on the cellar, the mare's worn saddle strap. He cooked, chopped wood, left extra pelts by her bedroll. Neither of them spoke of the past or the wreckage that still burned in the far reaches of her memory. They didn't need to. The scars on his knuckles, the way he flinched at thunder, the old rifle kept too close to hand. She saw those, too, said nothing. But silence had begun to change its shape between them. Some nights she sat by the fire long after he'd gone quiet in his chair, watching the flame like it might speak if she just stared hard enough. Once, in the darkest stretch before dawn, she murmured, "It wasn't supposed to be like that." He didn't ask what she meant. Just nodded slow and said, "It rarely is." The next morning she told him her name, not like a gift, like a truth. "Ada," she said. He didn't smile, but he said it back like it mattered, and it did. The thaw came slow, like a secret trying to remember itself. Snow softened in patches along the creek, and mist rose from the earth at dawn, smelling of wet moss and old roots. The pine needles bared themselves again, dribbling cold water onto shoulders and horses and hats. Tracks began to hold in the mud, and with them, the weight of choices returned. Ada woke most days before the rooster. She'd sit at the edge of the barn with a tin cup between her palms, watching the first light wash the ridge. The world still felt unfamiliar, quieter than it ought to be, but the silence no longer screamed in her ears. Callum noticed the way her hands had stopped shaking when she stitched leather. how her limp no longer slowed her so much she avoided walking. The knife he'd given her stayed, tucked into her boot, but her eyes didn't flick to it so often anymore. He didn't ask her what she'd run from. He'd seen plenty of women ride hard from worse. But sometimes, when she moved through the house in shadows, he'd catch the scent of burned cotton and gunpowder, and he'd wonder. What had burned down behind her that she hadn't dared to name? One evening, she brought him a rabbit, skinned and cleaned, left wordless on the table. Her hands were red from the cold and the work, but she didn't linger to see his reaction. Just walked out, shoulders set like armor. He cooked it slow and said nothing when she took seconds. Their language was mostly presence. A nod, a door held open, a second plate served. 2 mugs poured from the same kettle without needing to ask. In February, he taught her to shoot. She didn't want to, not at first, said the noise made her stomach turn. But he stood beside her in the clearing with the old Remington, steady and unhurried. "You don't have to fire," he said. "Just hold it, know the weight." She lifted it with both hands, surprised maybe by how heavy it was. Callum watched her stance, the way her jaw tightened. She hadn't held a weapon like it was protection in a long time, only as a last breath. "It's just a tool," he said, "same as the knife." "I know what it is," she said. But she didn't put it down. By spring, she could hit the fence post from 20 paces. The first flowers pushed up through the frost along the creek, stubborn as anything. Ada knelt beside them one morning, just watching. Her fingers didn't reach out. She didn't pluck them, just looked like someone remembering softness. Later that week, she stitched new reins for the mare. Then one night she asked him about the scar on his brow. He glanced at her, surprised. Not that she'd noticed, it was impossible to miss, but that she'd asked. Until then, everything between them had lived in the realm of unspoken permission. "Bayou," he said, after a long sip of coffee, "got careless clearing a trench. Paid for it." She nodded slowly. "How long ago?" 14 years, still flinches when the rain comes heavy. She leaned back in her chair, watching the firelight flicker across his face. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The fight. The living." He didn't answer right away, just looked at her like the question was larger than the room could hold. "Sometimes," he said at last, "but not tonight." Ada didn't smile, but something in her eyes warmed. Like the coals in the stove, slow and sure. She didn't reply, just tossed another log onto the fire and let it crackle into the silence. That spring, she cut her hair. He came back from checking the north fence line to find her out by the rain barrel, scissors laid beside her like a weapon she'd just surrendered. Her braid lay coiled like a snake in the mud. He didn't comment, but she caught him watching. "It was heavy," she said. He nodded. "Looks better this way." She blinked at that, then to his surprise she smiled, the first real one. That night she fell asleep in the rocker, book open in her lap, boots still on. He covered her with a quilt and let the lamp burn low. By the time the first thunder rolled across the hills in late April, she no longer looked over her shoulder. Not often, not with fear. And when the rains came, she didn't flinch from the sound. But in the dark, sometimes, when the house creaked like bones in a storm, she'd shift in her bedroll and Callum would hear her whisper, not words, just breath. Like she was trying to speak to someone who'd long since stopped answering. He never asked who. Some wounds don't close. They just stop bleeding. May broke like a long-held sigh. The trees thickened with green, and the river ran strong again, clear enough to see trout flash silver beneath the surface. The house smelled of damp earth and rising bread. Windows were kept open now, and the wind came through soft, carrying the scent of lilac and pine. Ada had taken to tending the garden behind the barn, turning the soil with her hands, planting rows of beans and squash, and something yellow she didn't name. She worked with a quiet rhythm, sleeves rolled to her elbows, freckles darkening on her nose. Her limp was still there, but she no longer leaned on the crutch. She burned it in the stove herself, one evening without ceremony. Callum watched her from the porch sometimes, mug in hand, eyes narrowing against the sun. He didn't say it aloud, but the sound of her moving through the yard, humming under her breath, had become something he noticed in its absence. One morning, she brought him an old tin of nails she'd found under the floorboards. "Guess this house has more bones than either of us," she said. He chuckled low. "Most of the good ones do." The conversation settled into the dust. But the air between them carried something new that spring, an understanding deeper than what was spoken. They began riding together, quiet loops around the edge of the land, down through the cottonwoods near the creek. She rode the black mare, sure and upright, even when the saddle bit into her hip. He rode beside her, sometimes pointing out where the elk passed through, sometimes saying nothing at all. One ride, she asked him why he stayed so far out from town. He looked out at the ridgeline before answering. Town's full of folks who think they know what a man's lived. Out here, quiet's honest, doesn't pretend. She nodded, reins slack in her fingers. I think I came here to be forgotten. He glanced at her. You're not. She didn't look at him, but her grip tightened. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she took her boots off and walked barefoot through the tall grass. Callum sat on the fence and watched her like he was afraid to speak and break whatever spell had let her do it. She'd changed, or maybe she'd just begun remembering who she'd been before fire and blood and running. One night the wind came sharp again, brought with it a sound Ada hadn't heard in months, the distant rhythm of hooves, fast and many. She stood from the porch like she'd been shot, eyes scanning the trees. Callum rose behind her, calm but alert. His hand found the rifle leaning against the post. They waited. Minutes passed, long and quiet. The sound faded into the night, no sign of riders, no dust trail or voices. Just ghosts carried on wind and nerves. Ada exhaled, sat hard on the steps, head in her hands. Callum stood nearby, not touching her, just there. You still run in your sleep, he said gently. She looked up. Not as far, though. No, he agreed, not as far. By mid-June, the town came calling in letters. Requests for supplies, word from old army friends, a neighbor's broken axle needing help. Callum went into town every 2 weeks or so. Ada never came with him, not once. Too many eyes, she said, too many stories. He didn't press, but one day he returned with a dress wrapped in brown paper. Simple, practical. Blue as cornflower. She found it on her bedroll, folded neat, no note. She didn't wear it right away, but she kept it close. That same week, a trader came riding up the lane, lost and half-drunk, asking after the pass north. He barely looked at Ada, called her girl, and asked if her husband was home. Callum's silence was a thing with teeth. Ada answered before he could. I'm not anyone's, but I'm here. The trader blinked, coughed, and changed the subject. Left with directions and a jug less full. When he was gone, Callum offered her a half-smile. You handled that. I've handled worse. I know. She didn't speak for a while after that, just went back to her mending, stitches tight and even. The next morning she wore the blue dress, came into the kitchen barefoot, hair wet from the creek, eyes steady. Callum saw her, not as something broken, not as someone hiding, but like sunlight through a storm. Like a thing you never expected to find again. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. That night they sat outside watching fireflies rise from the tall grass. Her shoulder brushed his once. He didn't move away. She didn't either. July came in dry and sharp, the kind of heat that baked the dirt into a crust and made the horses restless in their stalls. The creek shrank down to a ribbon, and even the pine trees whispered less. Dust clung to the hem of every step. They worked around it. Early mornings, late evenings. The rhythm of chores and shared meals, the occasional shared smile when the silence between them bent warm instead of wary. Callum had taken to leaving the front door open after supper, letting the evening air drift through the house. Most nights, Ada sat on the porch rail, one leg tucked under her, watching the sky shade from gold to blue. She didn't talk much, but her stillness was different now, less like waiting, more like settling. One night, as the crickets sang and the lantern threw long shadows, she asked, "What did you lose?" He didn't turn to her. Just let the question hang. Before this, she said, softer, what was the wreckage you ran from? Callum's jaw shifted, but he didn't look away from the dark. A brother, he said, and who I was, I guess. After that, didn't feel like I fit in a world that kept moving. Ada nodded like she understood, because she did. And you, he asked. She let the pause stretch. Then, a husband, not that I wanted to keep him. But he died anyway, and they blamed me for it. Fire took the rest. There was nothing in her voice but truth. No tremble, no plea, just the facts of a life carved out by pain. I believe you, Callum said. I didn't ask you to. I know. She looked at him then. In the dark, his face was half shadow, but his voice was steady. The kind of steady a person only earns by not breaking when they should have. I didn't kill him, she said. I didn't think you did. They sat in the silence that followed. It wasn't peace, not quite, but it was a beginning, like the first breeze before a rain. Later that night, a storm did come, cracked open the sky and flooded the hills. Ada stood at the window watching it roll in, lightning illuminating her face in flashes. She didn't flinch. Callum stood behind her, not close, just near enough to be known. When the thunder passed and the rain softened, she spoke. I ain't running anymore, she said. I know, he answered. The next morning, she came in from the barn with straw in her hair and a question in her mouth. I want to buy land, she said. Not far, just mine. He raised an eyebrow. You have money. Some, she said. Buried it in a coffee tin 2 winters back. Thought I'd need it to keep running. And now? Now I want to grow something. He nodded. I know a parcel west of the ridge, old grazing land. No one's claimed it in years. I'd like to see it. So they rode. The land she chose was rough and sloped, full of brambles and sun-bleached bones. But it held water, and the wind moved clean through the grass. She stood in the center of it, arms crossed, eyes scanning the sky. This'll do, she said. Callum didn't question her, just offered a quiet, I'll help you build. She glanced at him, a flicker of something behind her expression. Not gratitude. Not need, just recognition. In the weeks that followed, they hauled timber and stone, cut beams and shaped a roofline with bare hands and stubbornness. She worked beside him every hour, her palms blistered and her back sore, but she never faltered. She wanted this, a place with her name on it, even if she never carved it into a sign. The cabin rose from the earth like a promise. One afternoon, as they hammered in the last board, a hawk cried overhead. Ada looked up, hands shielding her eyes, watching it spiral higher into the blue. Callum leaned against the beam beside her. You're different, he said quietly. So are you, she answered. He didn't ask what she meant. That night they shared bread and salt on her porch. No toasts, no speeches, just 2 people who'd lived through the worst of things, now sitting in the soft light of something unspoken. Ada rested her head against the frame behind her, eyes closed. Callum watched her a long moment. He still didn't touch her, but he stayed. By the time the leaves turned, Ada's cabin was more than a shell. Smoke curled from its chimney, a garden wrapped tight around its sides, and chickens scratched the dirt near the back fence. She built it with her own hands, Callum, too, though he never asked for thanks. He came by most mornings with coffee or news of elk tracks in the hills, sometimes with nothing but his quiet. She let him in always. Autumn laid gold across the valley. The world moved slower again, as if even time had taken to watching them. There was no grand moment when Ada said she was staying for good, no declaration. But the way she held herself, shoulders square, boots planted firm, said it without needing breath. One evening, a letter came by a writer from town. Ada turned it over in her hands, the seal cracked and the handwriting crooked. Her past had found her, but it came now as paper, not flame. She read it once by lamplight. Then burned it in the stove and watched the ashes swirl. Callum didn't ask, but she told him anyway later as they walked the creek's edge and let the cold bite gently at their cheeks. They cleared me, she said. Said it was ruled an accident after all. He paused in his step. That change anything? Ada shook her head. Not what matters. She looked up then, at the sky the color of pewter, at the pine tops swaying like slow breath. What matters, she said, is this dirt under my nails, these days that don't feel borrowed. He nodded. Then it's yours, all of it. That night she stood on her porch and watched his shape fade into the dark toward his own house, and for the first time she called after him. Callum. He stopped, turned. Her voice was steady but soft. You could stay. He didn't move right away, just let the quiet settle, let the wind shift. Then he came back. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Inside, the fire was low. She poured 2 mugs, hands calm. He watched her move like she belonged in that space, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as something rooted. She sat beside him, not touching, not speaking. And after a while her hand found his, Not like reaching, like resting. The snow returned slow that winter, quiet and without rage. They split their time between both cabins, but it didn't much matter where they slept. The line between his land and hers had blurred into the space between their chairs, their voices, the tracks they left side by side. Sometimes she still woke with a start, sweat on her skin, breath caught between past and present. And always, without question, he was there, sometimes just a hand over hers, sometimes the sound of coffee brewing before sunrise. She never said thank you, he never asked her to. They built a fence together in the spring, not to keep things out, but to mark what they'd made. Posts driven deep, wire strung taut, a line that said, "This place is held, this place is kept." By June, wildflowers spilled along the edge of the garden. Bees moved slow and content, and the mare dropped a foal with legs too long for its body. Ada named it Mercy. And one morning, just after the sun cleared the ridge, she stood barefoot in the grass, hair loose, and Callum watched her from the porch. He saw her still, not as something mended, not as someone new, but as herself, weathered, strong. The kind of light that breaks through storm clouds and stays. And this time he went to her, not to rescue, but to stand beside. Together they watched the sky and let the day begin.